Welcome everyone. In this video, we'll give you an overview of the Ontario Breeding Bird Atlas III Marshbird Survey. The Atlas Marshbird Survey is one of the 3 special surveys for Atlas III. The others are owl and nightjar special surveys. I'd like to point out right off the top that there are, at least in my mind, many conceptual similarities between the field protocols for each of these 3 special surveys and the advanced Atlas point counts. So if you're finding the many details a bit overwhelming, you'll be happy to know that there are at least some overlap at a high level in how all these are set up. So first things first, why do we even need a special Atlas Marshbird survey? As some of you may know, we already have the Great Lakes Marsh Monitoring Program delivered by Birds Canada. And a few marsh birds are picked up on regular roadside Atlas point counts. So can't we just use data from these other programs to get what we need for marsh birds? Well, perhaps unsurprisingly, the answer of course is no, we can't just use data from these other programs. The Great Lakes Marsh Monitoring Program has good coverage in southern Ontario south of the Shield, as you see here, but coverage is too sparse in central Ontario and it's pretty well non-existent in northern Ontario to get what we want. And we tried mapping marsh birds using regular roadside point count data from Ontario Breeding Bird Atlas II, and there's just too few detections of these secretive species for it to work well. So we've designed the Atlas III Marshbird Survey to fill these knowledge and data gaps. We anticipate 2 main science products from the effort. One, the first ever abundance maps for marshbird species like American coot, common gallinule, least bittern, pied-billed grebe, Sora, and Virginia rail. And 2, the first ever robust total population size estimates for these same species for the entire province, both of which will be extremely useful in many different ways for conservation planning. So what's involved? In terms of skill level, participants must be able to identify all local birds by sight and sound. Although if you're not quite up to that, then Atlas Marshbird surveys can be completed as digital point counts by using Zoom recorders to record the entire survey so it can be interpreted later by others. Being able to identify common wetland plants is also helpful, as there is a simple habitat assessment to be done at each survey location, but as we shall see, good plant ID is not required. The Marshbird survey occurs throughout the entire province. But to ensure a representative sample of squares, we've randomly identified priority Marshbird survey squares, which you see here. These have been stratified in various ways, as indicated by the different colors, and by anticipated atlaser capacity, with fewer squares selected per unit area north of Temagami and more south of Temagami. However, atlasers are encouraged to complete the Marshbird survey in any square if they wish, even if it isn't a priority. Marshbird surveys completed in any square are very useful, but obviously the priority squares are the focus. You can view a map of the Marshbird survey priority squares on the coverage map under the Tools and Resources tab on the Atlas website. Some of these priority squares will be green and some blue. The green ones will be completed by Birds Canada staff, whereas the blue priority Marshbird squares will need the Marshbird survey completed in them. The timing is 24th of May to 10th of July south of Temagami, and 1st of June to 10th of July north of Temagami. These are the same date windows as regular roadside Atlas point counts. Surveys can be done in the morning or evening, morning being 30 minutes before sunrise until 5 hours after sunrise, and evening being 4 hours before sunset until 30 minutes after sunset. These are the same timing windows as regular roadside Atlas point counts for morning and the Great Lakes Marsh Monitoring Program for evening. Evening surveys are allowed because detection probabilities of the targeted species like bitterns and rails are very similar in the morning or the evening, and allowing evening surveys makes things more flexible for atlasers to get everything done. Like owl and nightjar surveys, there are restrictions on acceptable weather in terms of wind and precipitation. And like owl surveys, a standardized broadcast of targeted bittern and rail species is played using an amplified speaker during each survey. These secretive species are very territorial and frequently respond to the broadcasts, which of course dramatically boosts the detections of these species to a level that would generate the data we're after. The overall concept of how things work within a square is similar to owl and nightjar special surveys. Here's a couple of examples. At the most basic, you use the regular roadside atlas point count stations to locate 1 to 8 randomly chosen Marshbird survey point count stations, and then you perform at least one 10-minute point count at each station. An optional second point count at each station, at least 10 or more days later, but in the same year, is highly encouraged, but certainly not required. The second visit allows us to adjust for various differences in detection probabilities, but we don't need this to be done at all stations. It's fine if you can only do one survey for whatever reason, but it's gold, so to speak, if you can do the 2 visits. So how does one determine where the actual Marshbird survey point count stations are within a square? Well, here's probably the most unique and the most challenging aspect of the whole process. We weren't able to randomly pre-select the stations ahead of time, as is the case for owl and nightjar special surveys, which are done at the regular roadside point count stations. We weren't able to do this because existing geospatial GIS layers for identifying Marshbird habitat is, somewhat surprisingly, not good enough at fine enough scale across most of the province. So instead, you will randomly identify Marshbird survey stations within a square in 2 steps. 1, randomly identify Marshbird habitat patches, shown here in blue, and 2, identify Marshbird survey stations within or at the edge of Marshbird habitat patches, shown here as black dots. There is a detailed definition of what constitutes a Marshbird habitat patch in the protocol manual, but briefly here, a Marshbird habitat patch is a marsh or open-grown bog, fen, or shrub wetland, or a mix of these wetland types that is at least 1 hectare in size. A Marshbird habitat patch is not a shallow, unvegetated lake, nor is it a swamp with dense, relatively tall trees that form a mostly closed canopy overhead. And of course, this definition is meant to capture all of the potential types of wetlands throughout the province that we expect the targeted Marshbird species like bitterns and rails to occur in. So how does this all shake out when applied to an actual square? Here's an example. Start with designated roadside survey station number 1, which in this case is up at the top center. Then select the closest accessible Marshbird habitat patch that meets the criteria. And keep going, if you can, up to designated roadside survey station number 8. In this square, it was only possible to place 5 stations, and that's fine. In many squares, there won't be, or you won't be able to get access to 8 stations, and that's okay. Even 1 station in a square is very, very useful. Depending on road access and the arrangement of wetlands in any particular square, the placement of the stations can take many different forms, like you see here in some examples that are given in the protocol manual. Whether you follow the instructions exactly to identify Marshbird habitat patches is not necessarily all that important, so don't worry too much about whether you're getting it exactly right. The most important thing is that you randomly pre-select Marshbird habitat patches, and not just go to your favorite spots. How one achieves that is not necessarily all that important. You will find it useful to consult a combination of information from the Atlas Square Map, online aerial satellite imagery, and field observations to locate and confirm that Marshbird habitat patches meet the criteria. I find that Google Earth can be especially useful for scouting Marshbird survey point count stations. The ruler tool in circle mode will give you a sense of where the station boundaries will fall, and the historical imagery tool often gives a better sense of the type of wetland and what kind of vegetation it has. Plus, the street view feature often allows one to see firsthand what it'll be like to stand right at the survey location, like you see here, if in fact the station happens to fall on a roadway where there's coverage at street view. The protocol manual covers various scenarios that will crop up, such as what to do if there are no marshbird habitat patches, or more commonly, there are no accessible marshbird habitat patches within a priority square. And it also covers what to do in a square that has no roads, and therefore has no designated roadside point count stations. Once you've identified a marshbird habitat patch, then you will find a good accessible vantage point at the edge of or within each patch that is approximately closest to the designated roadside survey station that was used to identify the patch. This point is a marshbird survey station and is the location from which you will conduct the surveys. You will need to record the latitude and longitude of each station using a GPS unit, or alternatively your phone, so they can be recorded in the database. It is possible that one large marshbird habitat patch will be closest to one or more random roadside point count locations. In this case, you can place more than one marshbird survey station at the edge of or within the patch, as long as each station is greater than 400 meters apart. If the patch is all filled up, then proceed to the next nearest patch to the designated roadside point, and so on. Most marshbird survey stations will be at the edge of quiet back roads, but if they fall on busy roads with loud traffic, we encourage you to place them, if possible, a reasonable distance away from the road for better listening during surveys. If a marshbird habitat patch is greater than about 300 meters across at its widest point, then we encourage you to place stations at least 100 meters out into the interior of the patch and access them with a canoe or boat if possible. This is because many of the targeted marshbird species occur at greater abundance towards the middle of large wetlands. Please keep the following criteria in mind when placing marshbird survey stations, so that other atlasers, perhaps yourself, will more easily be able to revisit the stations in the future. Physically accessible at the time of year of the survey, legally accessible, i.e. no trespassing, near a safe parking spot, in a quiet location with little traffic, not directly in front of a house. Points should be at the very edge of or within the marshbird habitat patch, and more than 400 meters from any other marshbird survey station. Okay, so you've randomly identified marshbird habitat patches, and you've placed the survey stations at the edge of or within the patches. So what happens during actual surveys at these stations? Well, it's very much like a regular Atlas roadside point count, or point counts for either owl or nightjar special surveys. You stand quietly or sit quietly in your boat and count all birds seen or heard during a 10-minute period. You start the broadcast on your amplified playback equipment at the very start of the 10-minute count, and the broadcast keeps track of time for you. You will record on a map 5 pieces of information for each individual of each species that you see or hear during each survey. 1. Species. 2. Time interval of first detection of 3 possible time intervals. 3. Distance of first detection of 3 possible distance categories or bands. 4. Direction of first detection, in front of you or behind you. And 5. Breeding evidence if applicable. This approach is nearly identical to the most sophisticated regular Atlas roadside point count protocol, sometimes referred to as advanced point counts with time and distance, or 6 interval counts. Recording these many different pieces of information will allow us to make more robust population size estimates and to combine the data with other data sets like the breeding bird survey. At the time of your first marshbird survey, you will perform a simple marshbird habitat assessment. At each marshbird survey station, you'll record 4 pieces of marshbird habitat information. 1. Wetland type. 2. Presence of certain influential factors such as beaver dams. 3. Percent aerial coverage of major vegetation and land cover types. And 4. Percent aerial coverage of emergent non-woody plants. This sounds much more complicated than it really is, but if folks are turned off by it and don't wish to complete it, then as we describe in the instruction manual, you can take a picture of the station, send it to us, and we'll complete the habitat assessment using the picture and online imagery. This doesn't work as well, but it can be done, and I'm entirely willing to do it for you. So there you have it. That's why there's a need for the Atlas Marshbird survey and a high-level walkthrough of how the survey works. The rest of the details are in the instruction manual, which along with everything else you'll need, like field forms and the broadcast, are available for download on the Atlas website at birdsontario.org/marshbird-surveys. There you will also find a link to a companion video to this one, which explains how to enter Atlas Marshbird survey data into nature counts. So please take a look at that if you're entering data for this survey. I'd like to end by stressing that safety should be top priority while doing Atlas Marshbird surveys, as it should be with any atlasing activity. The Marshbird survey may find you in fairly isolated areas and might involve overwater work, so we provide a long list of tips of how to work safely during these surveys in the instruction manual, so please pay special attention to those. Thank you very much for your interest in the Atlas III Marshbird survey. I hope you find these surveys fun and rewarding. There's a lot of detail, but once you've done a couple of surveys, it should hopefully become clear and straightforward. Others who were initially reluctant to try these surveys, but did, have remarked on how they really enjoyed them, and that the random selection process for identifying survey stations took them to wetlands they might never have gone to otherwise, where they were delighted and very surprised to have Virginia rails and other secretive marshbird species respond to the broadcast. And finally, I'd like to thank all of the Atlas supporters shown here for making the Atlas Marshbird survey a success, and in particular, I'd like to thank Wildlife Habitat Canada for supporting the production of this overview video.